The wind had been screaming for 3 days straight. Not the quiet, whispering kind of wind that moves through pine branches and reminds you that the world is still breathing. This was the kind that pressed its full weight against the wooden walls of the shelter, searching for cracks, testing every joint and hinge like something with intent, like something that wanted in. I had learned, over the months I'd spent on that mountain, to listen to the difference. I was kneading dough when the tone shifted. My hands stilled against the countertop. Flour dusted my knuckles, and for a moment I stayed exactly like that, arms pressed into the soft resistance of the bread, while I catalogued the new sound weaving itself underneath the howling. Lower, rhythmic, not wind at all. Footsteps in deep snow move differently depending on the weight behind them. A deer's step is light and scattered. A human's is hesitant, irregular. But a wolf, even in human form, lands with a kind of deliberate certainty, like each footfall is a small declaration. I counted 4, maybe 5. I let out a slow breath and went back to kneading. My name is Annie, and I have been many things in my life that I did not choose to be. I was chosen last at every gathering. I was the one whose name took a moment too long to remember. The one adults looked past at ceremonies, and ranked wolves looked through at assemblies. An Omega, the bottom of every hierarchy I had ever been placed into. The softest note in a chord that nobody was listening to. I had pale blonde hair that I kept in a practical braid most days, and eyes the color of the sky just before it decides to snow. Gray, uncertain, difficult to read. I was not particularly tall. I was not particularly loud. I did not possess the kind of presence that fills a room before the body does. What I had, instead, was this. A shelter in the northern reach that had been abandoned for 11 years. A cast-iron wood stove I had coaxed back to life with nothing but patience and a bent flue brush, and the knowledge, inherited from years of necessity, not luxury, of how to make something from almost nothing. I had arrived in early autumn, carrying what fit in one pack. I had rehung 2 doors, patched the roof before the first frost, and filled every crack along the north wall with a mixture of pine resin and wool batting I'd unraveled from a ruined blanket. By the time the first real snow fell, the shelter was warm enough that I slept without a second layer. Nobody had expected me to last. That was, I was beginning to understand, a pattern in my life. People setting low expectations, and then being mildly inconvenienced when I exceeded them. The bread went into the oven at just past midday. The storm outside was at its worst by then, the kind of whiteout that erased distance entirely. You could stand on the front step and not see the woodpile 4 meters away. I had gone out at dawn to bring in enough wood for 2 days, and had not opened the door since. The shelter smelled of spruce smoke, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, and now, slowly, warmly, of yeast and crust beginning to brown. I was brewing pine needle tea when I heard them again. Closer now, and more than I'd counted before. I set the kettle down with careful quiet and moved to the east-facing window, the one with the thinnest frost, because it faced away from the wind. I wiped a small circle clear with the heel of my palm and looked out. Through the driving white, shapes were moving. 6 of them, hunched against the blizzard, arms pulled close, one supporting another who seemed to be struggling. They were moving in the direction of the shelter with the kind of exhausted, single-minded focus of people who no longer have the energy to consider alternatives. Wolves, unmistakably. Even in human form, they moved in a formation too instinctive to be accidental. Loose triangle, protective flanks, the weakest one at the center. My heart did something complicated in my chest. I thought about the bread in the oven. I thought about the fact that 6 unknown wolves arriving at an unmapped shelter in a blizzard could mean anything, and most of those things were not pleasant. I thought about being small and overlooked, and the bottom of every room I had ever entered. Then I went and unlocked the door. "Hello," I said, opening it before they reached the steps. The figure at the front of the group stopped. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual use rather than display, and he was looking at me with an expression I would come to recognize over the days that followed, though I did not have a name for it yet. It was the expression of a person who has arrived expecting one thing and found instead something that requires recalculation. Behind him, the 5 others had stilled. Snow drove sideways between us. "We saw smoke," the tall man said. His voice was low, controlled, the kind of voice that was accustomed to being obeyed quickly. He had dark hair plastered wet against his forehead and eyes that, even at this distance in this light, caught the faint glow from inside the shelter with unusual clarity. He was assessing me, doing it quickly and thoroughly, the way only people trained to evaluate threats assess things. "The smoke is mine," I said. "Come inside before you lose another degree." He did not move immediately. None of them did. I understood the hesitation. A lone Omega in an unmapped shelter, opening a door without fear. It did not fit the expected narrative. I watched him recalculate again. "We're 7, he said. "I can see 6, I replied. "Is the 7th far behind?" A beat. Something shifted in his face. Not softness exactly, but a kind of suspended attention. "About 20 minutes. He turned an ankle in a ravine. Then come in and I'll leave the door unlatched." I stepped back to make room. "The bread will be done in 10 minutes and the tea is already hot." They came in the way large, dangerous things sometimes do when they're too tired to perform. Carefully, almost quietly, shaking snow from their coats and looking around the shelter with expressions that moved between wariness and something closer to disbelief. It was not a grand space. One main room with the iron stove dominating the south wall, a rough wooden table with 4 mismatched chairs, 2 narrow cots pushed against the east wall, and the herbs and dried provisions hanging from the ceiling in neat clusters. The floor was swept. A low lantern burned on the windowsill. On the stove, the kettle whispered. I watched them take it in. The woman among them, sharp-featured, dark-eyed, her black hair cut severely at the jaw, said nothing, but her eyes moved across the room in a single, comprehensive sweep before landing back on me. She looked like someone who filed information away without commenting on it. I noted her. There was a younger man, barely past 20, with the hollow-cheeked look of someone who had been out in the cold too long. He had started shivering the moment he crossed into the warmth, the delayed kind of shivering that meant his body was only now admitting what it had been through. I moved past him to the second cot and pulled the folded blanket from it. "Sit," I told him. Not unkindly. He sat, looking slightly stunned. I draped the blanket around his shoulders and handed him a mug of tea before he had the chance to decide whether to thank me or be embarrassed by needing it. The tall man watched this. I noticed him noticing, the way you notice weather, as a fact, not a feeling. "Aiden," said the dark-haired woman, her voice carrying a note of caution. "Just the name. Nothing else." The tall man, Aiden, held up one hand slightly, a small gesture that meant something among them, because she went quiet. He was still looking at me. "This shelter isn't on any PAX-registered territory," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was the kind of statement that expects to be answered. "No," I agreed. "It's on mine." Another silence. Outside, the storm pushed at the walls with renewed energy, and the iron stove ticked and breathed and kept us all enclosed in its radius of warmth. "You're Omega," he said. "I am." "You're alone." "I was," I said, and moved to take the bread out of the oven. The smell that rose when I opened the oven door was immediate and complete. Warm, yeasty. The kind of smell that bypasses thought entirely and goes directly to something older and quieter in the chest. I heard someone in the group exhale. Heard, unmistakably, the sound of several tense bodies releasing some small fraction of their held vigilance. I set the loaf on the wooden board and reached for the bread knife. "There's a 7th coming," I said, without turning around. "Someone should go back to the door and watch for them." A pause. Then softly, the sound of one person breaking away from the group and moving toward the entrance. I began to slice. Behind me, the Alpha King of the Northern Reach stood in a shelter that should not have been warm, looking at bread that should not have existed, trying to reconcile what he had been told about the lone Omega in the mountains with what was, plainly, in front of him. I could feel his gaze on my back like a second kind of warmth. I kept slicing, steady, unhurried, as if enormous men with complicated eyes appeared in my doorway every Thursday. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, the bread was golden. The 7th wolf arrived 23 minutes later. I know, because I had been counting, in the quiet way I count things when I am trying not to think too directly about something else. Like the fact that the man standing near my stove had not sat down. Like the fact that he had not accepted the bread I had set on the table for the others, though I had seen his eyes move to it twice. The door opened on a gust of cold that made the lantern flame lean sideways, and 2 figures came through. The young man posted at the entrance helping to support a third, who moved with the careful, controlled effort of someone managing pain without wanting to show it. He was older than the others. Gray threaded through his dark beard, and his jaw was set tight. "Roan," said the dark-haired woman, whose name I had gathered, was Sable, moving toward him immediately. "I'm fine," he said, which was the thing people always say when they are managing pain without wanting to show it. "Sit down," I said, pulling out the chair nearest the stove. "And take off the boot before the swelling makes that impossible." He looked at me. It was the same look most of them had given me at some point in the last half hour. The brief, recalibrating pause of someone who had expected something other than what I was. "Who is she?" he asked, directing the question sideways at Aiden. "She lives here," Aiden said, simply. Roan sat. I brought cold water in a metal basin and a strip of cloth I tore from a clean piece of linen kept folded in the supply chest. I worked without commentary. The ankle was swollen but not broken. I could tell by the way he flinched at pressure along the sides, but not at the bone itself. I wrapped it with even tension, neither too tight nor too loose, and set the basin aside. "Keep it elevated tonight," I said. "It'll be better by morning if you do." "You've done this before," he said. Not a question. "Enough times," I said, and stood. By the time darkness came fully down, which happened fast in the Northern Reach during storms, the sky going from bruised gray to solid black in under an hour, there were 7 wolves seated or stretched across every available surface in my shelter, and the bread was gone, and I was making a second pot of broth from the dried provisions I kept in the cold chest. Nobody had asked me to. I had simply started doing it, because the math was obvious. 7 people, most of them cold down to the muscle. A storm that was not letting up before morning. Bread was a kindness. Broth was a necessity. I was aware of the dynamics in the room the way you're aware of pressure changes before a storm, not always consciously, but in the body, in the small adjustments you make without thinking. The younger ones had relaxed faster. The boy I had given the blanket to. His name was Kale, I had learned, and he was barely 22 and was doing his best to appear unimpressed by absolutely everything. Had started asking me quiet questions while the others talked amongst themselves. How long had I been here? Where had I come from? Did the storms usually last this long? I answered plainly. Early autumn. From the valley packs, broadly speaking. And yes, in the Northern Reach. 3-day blizzards were not unusual. 4-day ones happened. I had weathered a 5-day one alone in October, and had spent it reorganizing my provisions and learning to play a song on the battered wooden flute I had found hanging on the wall when I arrived. Kale stared at me. "You played the flute alone for 5 days. I was not very good at it, I admitted. but I became significantly less bad. He laughed, a surprised, unguarded sound, and two of the others glanced over. Sable's eyes lingered on me a half-second longer than the others. Aiden did not laugh, but I caught, from the edge of my vision, the slight shift of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more restrained than that. An acknowledgement, maybe. The face of someone adding new information to a picture they are still building. He came to stand near the stove while I stirred the broth. I had been expecting it, in the way you expect weather, not knowing exactly when, only that the conditions are right for it. He moved without announcing himself, settling at the far end of the counter with a careful distance that was nonetheless close enough to talk quietly without being heard across the room. "You knew who I was," he said, "when you opened the door." It was not vanity. It was a direct question framed as an observation, and it deserved a direct answer. "I didn't know your name," I said, "but I knew what you were, the formation, the way they moved around the injured one." I paused. Alphas don't usually come this far north unless they're running from something or moving toward it. He was quiet for a moment. "And which did you assume?" "Neither," I said honestly. "I assumed you were cold and hungry. Everything else felt secondary." The broth stirred in slow circles. The fire in the stove popped once, a small bright sound. "Most Omegas," Aiden said slowly, "would not have opened that door." "Most Omegas," I replied, "have been taught that the appropriate response to a knock is to wait and see if the danger passes." I lifted the spoon and tapped it once against the pot. "I've lived alone on a mountain for several months. I've lost patience with waiting." He turned to look at me fully then. Not the sideways, measuring look he had been using since he arrived, a direct one. It lasted long enough to feel like a question with no words attached to it. I met it. I stirred the broth. "Your hands," he said, after a moment. His voice had shifted just slightly. The controlled tone remained, but something underneath it had adjusted. The way a key changes a lock. "You wrapped Roan's ankle like someone who's had training." I had a teacher once. I reached for the wooden bowls stacked on the shelf. She believed that knowing how to care for people was the most important skill any wolf could carry. Not the most impressive one. Not the one that earns respect in a room. I began ladling broth. But the most important. I felt him looking at the side of my face. "Who was she?" he asked. "Someone who is no longer here," I said, and kept my voice steady. Because it was true, and because grief is a private country, and I had long since learned to carry mine without opening it in front of strangers. A pause. He didn't press. That surprised me. "I'll take that," he said instead, reaching for two of the bowls. I looked at his hands on the wooden bowls. Large hands, capable ones, a scar running along the outside of the right one from wrist to knuckle. Old, well-healed, the kind of scar that becomes invisible until the light hits it right. "The table has room for 7 if you push the cots aside," I said. He looked at the room. At his people, scattered and tired, holding their warmth like something fragile. Then he set the 2 bowls back down, turned, and said something to Sable in a low tone. She looked at me across the room. Her expression was unreadable, which I was beginning to understand was simply her face, not a judgment. Then she stood and began quietly to move things. We ate at the table. All 8 of us. It was a crowded, slightly absurd arrangement. Kale ended up on an upturned crate, and Roan kept his wrapped ankle propped on a spare log with a patience that suggested he had been in worse situations. The broth was not remarkable. Dried mushrooms, preserved onion, a pinch of the smoked meat I had rationed carefully all winter. But it was hot. and there was enough of it, and the room smelled of bread warmth and wood smoke, and the storm that raged outside seemed, in the way of all storms, slightly less enormous when you were sitting inside it with other people. I sat at the end of the table that was closest to the stove. Aiden sat at the other end. I noticed that the others, without any visible discussion or instruction, had arranged themselves so that a clear sightline remained between the two ends of the table. I didn't know if they were aware of doing it. I was fairly certain Aiden was. The conversation that emerged was careful at first. Practical things, weather conditions, the terrain, how long the storm might hold. Kale asked about the herbs on the ceiling, and I named them without looking up. Lavender for sleep, rosemary for headaches, dried thyme, and sage for infections, valerian root if things got truly difficult. He looked at the ceiling with renewed interest. One of the others, a quiet, broad-shouldered man named Dax who had said almost nothing since arriving, looked up too, then at me, and nodded once, slowly, as if settling something in his mind. Sable spoke for the first time at length, asking about the shelter's water source. "There's a covered cistern on the east side," I said. "I built a wind barrier around it in November. The water stays clear even in hard freezes." "You built it," she said. "I built it," I confirmed. She looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then she looked at Aiden. He was watching me. He had been watching me with the same contained, undemonstrative attention for the better part of an hour, and I was running out of ways to feel normal about it while also pretending I hadn't noticed. "You'll need the floor space tonight," I said, to the table generally. "There are 2 cots, but only one person should use them." I glanced at Roan. "That person is you. Don't argue." Roan opened his mouth. "Don't argue," I said again, pleasantly. Someone, I thought it was Dax, made a sound that might, in a different context, have been a quiet laugh. Roan closed his mouth. I began collecting the empty bowls. The storm outside reached what felt like a new intensity, a long, sustained howl that ran the full length of the roof. The lantern on the windowsill flickered, recovered, burned on. I stood at the wash basin with my back to the room, and for the first time since opening the door that afternoon, I let myself notice what I was actually feeling. Not fear. I had expected fear. Something else instead. Something that pressed against the inside of my ribs with the strange, tentative weight of a door opening inward. Annie. My name in his voice, the first time he had used it, was startlingly different from hearing it in my own head. I turned. Aiden was standing, holding the stack of bowls from his end of the table. His expression was the careful, unhurried one he seemed to default to, but his eyes held the same quality they had held all evening, that suspended, recalculating attention. Like a man who had arrived expecting ice and kept finding instead something warm. "Where do you want these?" he asked. I looked at him standing in the middle of my small shelter, the AlphaKing of the Northern Reach, holding a stack of wooden soup bowls, asking me where I wanted them. "Here," I said, and pointed to the counter beside me. He crossed the room and set them down, close enough that I could have counted the gray threads in his dark hair if I had wanted to. I turned back to the wash basin. My hands, beneath the water, were perfectly steady. Outside, the blizzard pressed on. Inside, the fire breathed. And somewhere between those two facts, something that had no name yet was beginning, quietly, to take shape. The storm broke on the morning of the second day. Not dramatically. The Northern Reach doesn't do dramatic endings. It simply loosened its grip, the way a hand opens when it's finally tired of holding something too tightly. I woke to a different quality of silence, the kind that has texture to it, that feels like a held breath finally let go. The wind had dropped to almost nothing. Through the frost-edged window, the sky was the pale, exhausted white of something that had spent itself completely. I had slept on the floor, on the folded wool mat I kept behind the supply chest. I had done it without announcing the arrangement or asking permission. Simply spread it out after everyone else had settled, wrapped myself in the remaining blanket and closed my eyes. I woke before any of them. That was habit, not intention. In a life spent being overlooked, you learn to exist in the quiet hours before the world decides to look at you. I rebuilt the fire from the banked coals, put water on, and had the oats started by the time the first of them stirred. It was Kale, inevitably. He emerged from whatever corner he'd claimed looking younger than ever. His dark hair flattened on one side, blinking at the warmth and the smell, with an openness he hadn't quite managed to maintain the evening before. "How are you already awake?" he said, less a question than a complaint. "I live here," I reminded him. He dropped into the nearest chair and wrapped both hands around the mug I handed him, with the focused gratitude of someone receiving something vital. "Sable is going to try to recruit you," he said, into the mug. "I'm telling you now, as a warning. Or possibly as an encouragement. I haven't decided." I stirred the oats. "Recruit me for what?" "Whatever she thinks you are." He sipped. "Which I can tell is not what she expected." I said nothing to that. Outside, the white morning held itself very still. Aiden was the last to wake, which surprised me. I had expected the opposite. Had expected him to be the first. The one who checked perimeters and counted heads, and reassessed everything in the thin early light. Instead, he emerged from near the north wall when the shelter was already half full of movement and quiet morning conversation. And he stood for a moment in the way that some people do when they have slept more deeply than intended and are recalibrating their sense of where they are. His eyes found me immediately. I was at the table, drawing a rough map of the Eastern Pass on a scrap of paper. Dax had mentioned the route they'd intended to take before the storm redirected them, and I knew the Eastern trails better than anyone still living who hadn't been born here. I didn't look up when Aiden crossed the room, but I was aware of him the way you're aware of a change in barometric pressure, in the body, before the mind has language for it. He sat across from me without being invited. I pushed a mug toward him without being asked. He looked at the map. "You know this terrain." "I've walked most of it." "In winter?" "In every season." I marked the bend in the ridge where the trail became treacherous after snowmelt. "This section looks passable from the north, but the ground underneath is unstable from the spring runoff. It's held 2 years running, but I wouldn't take 7 people across it." He leaned forward slightly to look at what I'd marked. Close enough that I could have described, without looking directly, the exact way his dark hair fell across his forehead. I kept my eyes on the map. "The southern route adds 4 hours, he said. "The southern route adds 4 hours and doesn't put 7 people on ground that might not hold," I replied. "You can decide which matters more." A pause. Then quietly. "You've walked it. Once, alone, in October." I set the pencil down. I turned back. He looked at me. There it was again. That quality of attention that felt less like being studied and more like being genuinely seen, which was a distinction I had not often had cause to make before, because they rarely felt like different things. "That's the most honest assessment of a trail I've ever received," he said. "Most people soften things," I said. "I find it wastes time." He was quiet for a moment. Something in his expression had shifted overnight. The controlled, assessing quality was still there, but underneath it, slightly less guarded than it had been. Sleep did that to people sometimes. Dropped the performance by a fraction. "How long have you actually been here?" he asked. Not the polite version of the question. The real one. 7 months. Alone the entire time? Yes. He looked at the herbs on the ceiling, at the patched north wall, at the stacked, carefully organized shelves. The tour of the shelter that his eyes were taking was slower than Sable's had been, and different in character. Less inventory, more something I didn't have a word for yet. "Why?" he asked. It was a simple word carrying a great deal of weight. I considered briefly how much of the real answer to give him. Because I needed to find out what I was when nobody was deciding it for me, I said. The shelter was quiet enough that I heard the fire shift in the stove. Heard Roan across the room, telling Dax something in a low tone about the ankle, which was visibly better this morning. He'd kept it elevated, as instructed, which I had not entirely expected. Aiden said nothing for a long moment. Then, "And what are you?" I looked at him directly. "Still finding out," I said, but warmer than expected. The corner of his mouth moved. That restrained, unfinished thing that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general territory. It lasted only a moment before he looked back at the map. "Show me the southern route," he said. I picked up the pencil. They did not leave that day. The snow was still too deep in the lower passes, and Roan's ankle, while better, was not ready for 4 additional hours of trail. I did not suggest they stay. I simply did not suggest they go. And Aiden, who struck me more and more as someone who made decisions based on actual conditions rather than pride, reached the same conclusion independently and said nothing about departing. By midday, the shelter had taken on a quality I had no prior experience with and found difficult to name. Occupied, not crowded. There was something organized about the way they moved through the space, an unconscious consideration for each other, and I noticed for me. Nobody took things without asking. Nobody left a mess without clearing it. Dax, who had still said very little, quietly restacked the firewood I had brought in that morning into a more stable configuration, and did it so unobtrusively I only noticed when it was already done. I appreciated that. The doing without announcement. Sable found me in the afternoon. I was outside, the first time I had opened the door since the storm broke, clearing the step and checking the cistern. The cold was bright and clean. The kind that comes after a storm has taken everything turbulent with it. The sky was a hard, polished blue. My breath came out in neat white clouds. She appeared at the door, and then, after a moment, came and stood beside me. We did not speak immediately. That was all right. I had learned that silence with someone you don't know well is not always uncomfortable. It depends on the weight of what's being held in it. "You wrapped Roan's ankle before you knew who we were," she said finally. "I knew you were cold, and that someone was hurt. That's not what I mean." She looked sideways at me. Her dark eyes were precise, the eyes of someone who processes information efficiently. "You didn't wait to establish the hierarchy. You didn't look for who was dominant before you decided how to respond." She paused. "Most people do. Most people are taught to," I said. "I spent a long time being at the bottom of hierarchies. It taught me that the hierarchy is usually the least relevant thing in the room when someone needs help." Sable was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very evenly, "He hasn't slept that well in 4 months. I kept my eyes on the cistern latch. That's not information I know what to do with." "You don't need to do anything with it," she said. "I'm just telling you." She turned and went back inside. I stood for a moment in the cold, bright air and said nothing to it. That evening was different from the first. The tension that had threaded through dinner the night before, the wariness, the careful management of proximity and language, had eased enough that something more natural had taken its place. Cale told a story about a navigation error that had ended with 3 of them stuck in a tree for 2 hours, and the laughter it produced was real and unguarded and filled the shelter with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. Even Dax laughed. Briefly, but genuinely. Roan told a story in return, something from years ago, about Aiden making a catastrophic error of judgment involving a river crossing, and a mule that I gathered was funnier with full context but was still funny without it. He told it with the precise comic timing of someone who had been waiting years for the right audience. I watched Aiden's face while Roan told it. He did not look embarrassed. He looked at Roan with an expression that contained, without sentimentality, a great deal of something that looked like it had been built over a long time and had survived difficult things to still be there. Affection was too small a word. Trust was closer. When the laughter settled, he glanced across the table and found me watching him. I did not look away. Neither did he. "Your turn," Cale said, looking at me with the bright, demanding energy of the young. "My turn for what?" "A story. Something from up here. 7 months alone. You must have something." I thought about the 5-day blizzard, about the flute, about the morning I had found paw prints in the snow outside that were larger than any wolf I had ever met, and had stood at the door for a long time deciding what they meant. "There was a night in November," I began, "when I heard something on the roof." The room stilled. It was too heavy for a branch, too rhythmic for debris, and it moved, slowly, from the east side to the west, directly over where I was sleeping. I looked at the ceiling. Everyone else did too, a shared instinct. I lay there for a very long time deciding what to do. I had an axe handle, not the axe. I had used the head for something else and hadn't replaced it yet, just the handle. "What did you do?" Cale asked. "I made tea," I said, and waited, and eventually it stopped. A beat. "What was it?" asked Dax. His voice, the first time I had heard it at length, was deeper than I'd expected. "I never found out," I said. "Whatever it was, it didn't come back." "That's a terrible ending," Cale said, but he was smiling. "Most things that frighten you in the night," I said, "don't come back. They're usually just passing through." The fire popped. Someone shifted. Outside, the snow lay still, and the sky was full of the particular fierce, indifferent clarity of winter stars in the northern reach. Thousands of them. So many they seemed almost excessive, as if the dark was trying to compensate for something. I looked up and found Aiden looking at me again, not assessing, this time, not recalibrating. Something quieter than that. Something that sat in the chest differently from how assessment sits. Heavier, slower. Like the difference between a door being tested and a door being opened. I looked back at the table. My heart did that complicated thing again. I did not name it. Not yet. But I stopped pretending I hadn't noticed it. They left on the 3rd morning. I knew it before anyone said anything. The shelter had a different feeling when I woke. A kind of purposeful restlessness. The particular energy of people reassembling themselves into the shape they wear when they are going somewhere. Boots pulled on with decision. Packs checked and rechecked. The quiet, efficient choreography of a group that has done this many times and does not need to discuss it. Roan tested his ankle near the door, putting weight on it with careful incrementalism, and nodded once to himself. Dax had already been outside, checking the trail conditions. He came back stamping snow from his boots and said 2 words. Passable, south, and that was enough. I made oats again. Nobody asked me to. It was simply what needed doing, and I was the one who knew where everything was. We ate quickly. The conversation was practical. The route, the timing, the weather window. Cale ate 3 portions with the unapologetic appetite of the young and offered to stay behind to help me resupply the firewood, an offer which I declined and which Sable vetoed simultaneously, which made him look briefly between us with an expression of theatrical suffering. Aiden said very little during breakfast. He sat at his end of the table and ate and looked at the map I had drawn, which he had folded carefully the evening before and placed in the inner pocket of his coat, a detail I had not been meant to notice, and had noticed anyway. When the bowls were cleared, people began moving toward the door in the natural drift of departure. I stayed at the counter, washing the last of the mugs, listening to the small sounds of 7 people preparing to re-enter the world. Roan paused beside me on his way out, The ankle, he said. It'll hold, I said. Keep the wrapping on for 2 more days. He nodded. Then, gruffly, without quite looking at me, You're competent. Coming from Roan, I gathered, this was approximately equivalent to a formal commendation. Thank you, I said, seriously. Dax left without words, which was consistent, but he paused at the threshold and turned back and gave me the same slow, settled nod he had given me the first night over the herb ceiling. I received it as the thing it was. Sable stopped in front of me and held out a folded piece of paper. I took it, looked at her. If you ever come down from the mountain, she said precisely, that's how to find us. I held the paper. I'm not looking for a pack. I know, she said. That's not what I'm offering. She held my gaze for one steady moment. Think of it as a courtesy, from someone who keeps track of people worth keeping track of. She left before I could respond, which I suspected was intentional. Kale hugged me. It was sudden and unannounced and slightly too tight, the hug of someone young enough to still do it without calculating what it might communicate. I stood inside it for a surprised half-second and then returned it briefly, and he stepped back looking as if he had not entirely planned to do that, but didn't regret it. I'm going to tell everyone about the bread, he said. Please don't, I said. He grinned and went out the door. Aiden was last. The shelter was empty behind me. The morning light coming through the east window at the low winter angle that turned everything it touched, faintly gold. I was still at the counter. I heard his footsteps, unhurried, that deliberate wait, and felt the particular shift in the air that I had, over 2 days, apparently become sensitive to, without intending to. He stopped a few feet away. I turned. He was already in his coat, pack settled across his shoulders, looking entirely like what he was. A man who belonged to large, open spaces and difficult decisions, and the company of people who depended on him. The shelter, behind him, looked briefly smaller than it had before he was standing in the middle of it. He did not say anything immediately. Neither did I. The silence had a quality I had not experienced with him before. Not assessing, not cautious. Just present, like 2 people standing in the same weather and both choosing not to move. The map, he said finally. Keep it, I said. I know the terrain. He nodded slowly. Then, the southern route. You said you turned back. October conditions, I said. It's different now. Different how? Frozen solid, more predictable. I paused. You'll be fine. He looked at me for a moment, that open, unhurried look. Annie. My name in his voice was still doing the same thing it had done the first time, and I had not yet found a way to make it do otherwise. Thank you, he said. And it was not the polite, exit stage right kind of thank you. It was the kind that meant something specific, that had weight behind it, that referred to more than bread and broth and a wrapped ankle. You were cold, I said. I had a warm shelter. That's not all it was. I did not answer that. Because I did not have an answer, I was ready to speak out loud. I looked at the window instead, at the pale, recovering sky. Aiden. His name and my voice felt strange, too familiar, and not familiar enough at once. He looked at me with immediate attention. The eastern ridge, about a day north of the pass. There's a sheltered hollow that doesn't show on standard maps. If you're ever caught in weather again, I held his gaze. You'll know it by the 3 white pines that grew together at the base. The hollow behind them stays dry. He was quiet for a beat. You're giving me a shelter. I'm giving you a location, I said, in case. He looked at me for a long, unmoving moment. Outside, I heard the others at some distance, voices carrying on the clean post-storm air. He should have been moving. We both knew it. In case, he repeated softly. Then he turned and walked out the door. I stood at the window and watched 7 figures move south through the white, into the trail I had drawn for them on a scrap of paper. They moved well together, even over difficult terrain. The natural cohesion of people who had chosen each other through repeated hard things. I watched until the pines closed behind them. Then I turned back to my shelter and, for the first time in 3 days, heard nothing but the fire. 3 weeks passed. I replenished what had been used. A reasonable trade for 3 days of company, I decided, and not grudgingly. I baked. I walked the trails when the weather permitted, mapping sections I hadn't reached before the first hard frost. I repaired a weak section of the roof before the next storm could find it. I read from the small, battered collection of books I had brought with me, and I played the flute with the marginally improved competence of someone who has now had a winter of practice. I kept Sable's folded paper on the shelf above the stove. I did not unfold it, but I did not put it away. Cale had said Sable would try to recruit me. What Sable had actually offered was harder to categorize. Not a position, not an obligation. Something more like acknowledgement. A door left ajar. I was not accustomed to doors being left for me. On the 18th day, someone knocked. Not the uncertain, tentative knock of a lost traveler. Not the desperate pounding of someone caught in weather. A measured knock. 3 times, even spacing. The kind that expects an answer without demanding one. I knew, with a certainty that lived below thought, before I opened the door. Aiden stood on the step, alone this time. No storm behind him. No emergency in the set of his body. The sky above the pines was a deep, clear gray, the color of late afternoon in winter. And he was looking at me with that expression I had spent 3 weeks trying to accurately recall, and had, apparently, not quite managed, because seeing it again was different from remembering it. "The Eastern Ridge Hollow," he said. "I found it." I leaned against the doorframe. "I know. I left markers." "I know you did." He paused. "You left them on the approach, not the exit, so that someone coming down from above would miss them." I had, in fact, done exactly that. I said nothing. "You specifically left them for someone coming up from the south," he said. "The hollow is more useful coming from that direction," I said, which was true, and also not the entirety of the truth. He looked at me. The pale winter light was doing something to the angle of his face that I made a deliberate decision not to think too directly about. "I'm not here about the hollow," he said. "I know," I said. A beat. The pines moved slightly, an almost soundless shift of branches releasing their held weight of snow. "May I come in?" he asked. I studied him for a moment. This man who commanded an entire territory, who had stood in my shelter for 2 days without once making me feel that it wasn't mine, who had carried my soup bowls to the counter and asked where I wanted them. "Are you hungry?" I asked. The corner of his mouth, that almost smile. "I'm always hungry after that trail." I stepped back from the door. He sat at the table while I made tea. Real tea this time. I had managed to trade for a small quantity of proper black tea from a supply runner who passed through once a month and didn't ask questions. The shelter felt different with only him in it. Larger, somehow, which was counterintuitive, but there it was. Without the group, without the context of emergency and weather and 7 people managing their survival together, there was simply this. A room. A fire. 2 people occupying the same space by choice. I set the tea in front of him and sat across the table. He wrapped both hands around the mug, the way Cale had the first morning, and the gesture made me understand suddenly that these were, underneath everything else, people who moved toward warmth when they found it. Whatever else they were. "The Pack Council," he said after a moment. There are pressures, the kind that require the kind of decisions that affect a great many people, and don't have clean answers. I waited. He was someone who thought before speaking, and interrupting that process struck me as wasteful. Sable presented a report, he said. About the shelter. About what she found here. He paused. About you. I see, I said carefully. She used the word indispensable. He looked at his mug, which is not a word Sable uses about people. She offered me a way to find you, I said. Before she left. I haven't used it. I know. He looked up. That's partly why I'm here. The fire in the stove was burning low and steady, the comfortable, established burn of well-seasoned wood. Outside, the light was fading toward evening. I was aware, with sudden clarity, that I had not planned for dinner for two, and that this did not distress me the way practical gaps usually did, which told me something about the state of my attention. Aiden, I said. He waited. What are you actually asking me? He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I heard the fire breathe twice. I'm not sure yet, he said honestly. I know what I want to ask. I'm not certain I have the right. I looked at him, at the scar on his right hand wrapped around the mug, at the dark hair and the complicated eyes and the weight behind the careful stillness of him. Ask anyway, I said. I'll tell you if you don't. He looked at me for a long, suspended moment, and then slowly, he leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the table, and began to speak. And the shelter contracted gently around us, warm and close, the way spaces do when what's happening inside them is the most important thing in the world. He asked me to come down from the mountain, not as a demand, not as a command issued from someone accustomed to being obeyed. He asked the way people ask for things they are not certain they deserve, carefully, with full awareness of what the answer might cost the other person, and without attempting to diminish that cost. He told me about the territory, about the council, and the pressures Sable had alluded to, and the particular difficulty of leading a large pack through a period of transition when the world outside the Northern Reach was changing in ways that required new kinds of thinking. He told me about the healers they had lost, about the younger wolves who had no one to teach them the difference between what they could endure and what they needed help carrying. He told me that Kale had asked about me 4 times in 3 weeks, that Roan had mentioned, once, with the studied casualness of someone who does not wish to be caught caring, that the ankle had healed cleanly, and he attributed this to the wrapping technique. He told me that Sable had said, and I could tell, from the way he said it, that he was quoting precisely, "She is wasted on a mountain." And then he stopped talking, and looked at me, and waited. I looked back at him across the table in the low firelight. I thought about 7 months of silence that had been necessary and good, and that had given me something I had not previously possessed. A clear sense of my own dimensions, the shape of who I was when no one was deciding it for me. I thought about opening a door in a blizzard. I'm not looking for a pack to belong to, I said. I know, he said. I'm not interested in a hierarchy that will put me at the bottom of it because of what I am. I know that too. He held my gaze steadily. That's not what I'm asking. Then what are you asking? He unfolded his hands from the mug and placed them flat on the table, an open gesture, a deliberate one. I'm asking if you would be willing to be somewhere that needs what you already are. Not a different version of you. Not a quieter or smaller or more manageable version. A pause. You. As you are, who opens doors in blizzards and wraps ankles before establishing rank and makes bread in the middle of a 3-day storm because someone might need it. The fire breathed. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the deep winter gray. I thought about Sable's folded paper on the shelf above the stove, how I had not put it away. And you? I asked. What are you asking for yourself? Not the pack, not the council. I held his eyes. You. The question landed in the silence between us and stayed there. He did not deflect it, did not reframe it. He looked at me with that open, unhurried look that I had been trying to accurately recall for 3 weeks, and had not quite managed. I don't entirely know how to answer that, he said, without saying something I am not certain I've earned the right to say yet. Then say what you can, I said, and we'll go from there. He was quiet for a moment, then very simply, I have not stopped thinking about this shelter since I left it. The words were not dramatic. They were not elaborate. They sat in the room with the same plain, necessary quality as warmth, and they landed in my chest with a weight I did not try to minimize. Neither have I said. And that was all. And it was enough. I came down from the mountain in early spring. Not immediately. There were practical things to consider, and I was someone who considered practical things seriously. I spent 2 weeks making the shelter ready for absence rather than abandonment. I repaired what needed repairing. I left the firewood stacked, the cistern covered, the herbs that were still drying bundled and hung properly. I left the flute on its hook on the wall. I took my pack, my provisions, my collection of worn books, and the knowledge of the terrain that I carried, by now, in my body as much as my memory. On the last morning, I stood in the doorway and looked at the single room that had been, for 7 months, everything. The iron stove, the mismatched chairs, the ceiling with its empty hooks where the herbs had hung. I did not feel grief, exactly. I felt gratitude, which is what grief becomes when the thing you are leaving has done what it was supposed to do. I closed the door without locking it. The shelter had taken care of me when I needed it. It seemed only fair to leave it available. The pack's territory was larger than I had imagined from a distance. Not a single compound, but a spread of buildings and open space that had evolved naturally, the way things do when people are actually living in them, rather than performing the idea of living. There was a central hall, a training ground, a long, low building that served as the healer's space, largely empty when I arrived, its shelves sparse, its air carrying the faint chemical smell of supplies that had not been replenished properly in too long. I stood in the doorway of it on my first full day and took inventory. Sable appeared at my shoulder with a list she had already prepared, which told me she had been expecting this reaction and had thought several steps ahead of it. I took the list without comment. We went through it together, and I began making notes of my own in the margins. You can have whatever you need, she said. I need access to the northern supply routes and someone who knows the terrain above the second ridge, I said. I know the plants up there. I need someone who can carry. Kale, she said immediately. He'll complain about the cold. He'll complain about everything, she said. He'll also carry twice what you ask him to and not mention it. I looked at her. She was watching me with that precise, comprehensive gaze. Sable, I said. Thank you. For the paper. You thanked me by using it, she said, and went back to work. The pack took time to know me. That was all right. I had not expected otherwise. Some of them were uncertain. An Omega, unaffiliated, arriving without ceremony or clear status, being given access to the healer's space and Sable's trust, and it became evident quickly, the Alpha's ear. There were looks. There were conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. There was a woman named Petra, broad-shouldered and sharp-tongued, who challenged me twice in the first week in ways that were not quite direct enough to be confrontable. I did not perform confidence I didn't feel. I did not pretend the adjustment was effortless. I simply continued. I stocked the shelves. I treated what needed treating. When a young girl came in with a fever that had the other healers uncertain, I sat with her through the night and kept her cool and talked to her when she woke frightened until the fever broke at dawn. And when I came out of that room, Petra was in the hall, waiting, and she looked at me for a long moment, and then walked away without saying anything. She never challenged me a third time. Roan found me in the healer's space the following week, ostensibly to have me check the ankle one final time. I checked it. It was fully healed. He lingered afterward, looking at the shelves. "Better stocked," he said. "Getting there," I said. He picked up a bundle of dried rosemary and turned it in his fingers. "You know," he said carefully, "I've known Aiden for 11 years. I waited. He's made a lot of decisions in that time," Roan said. "Some of them easy, most of them not." He set the rosemary down. "He's never made one I thought he was wrong about." He looked at me directly, for the first time as frankly as he was capable of. "I want you to know that." "Thank you, Roan," I said. He nodded, gruffly, and left. Aiden and I built something slowly. That was deliberate, on both our parts, and it was right. It was not courtship in the formal sense. There were no declarations before the council, no ceremonies performed for the benefit of an audience. It was simpler and more durable than that. It was early mornings in the healer's space where he appeared sometimes with 2 mugs of tea and sat at the work table while I organized supplies, and we talked about the pack, about decisions pending, about the Eastern Ridge Hollow, and the trail I had drawn on a scrap of paper, about small things and large ones. It was his hand finding mine one afternoon in the hall, briefly and without preamble, the way you reach for something you have decided you are allowed to reach for. It was the particular quality of his attention, that open, unhurried look, that I had stopped trying to make myself not notice. It was the evening in late spring when the pack gathered in the central hall, and I was somewhere in the middle of it, not at the edges, and looked up to find Aiden looking at me from across the room with an expression that was fully unguarded for the first time since a blizzard had driven him to my door, open and certain, and entirely without performance. I looked back at him, and something that had been building for months settled, quietly, into place. A year from the day they had arrived at my door, I stood in the healer's space that was fully stocked now, fragrant with dried herbs from the northern trails that Kale and I had catalogued through the summer and autumn. Kale, who had complained about the cold persistently and accurately, and had carried everything I asked him to carry without mentioning it. He was better at navigation than he let on. I had told him so once, and he had looked insufferably pleased about it for 2 days. Sable knocked and entered. She looked at the shelves, at the organized rows, at the notes pinned to the board above the work table, where I had started recording treatments and outcomes, and what worked when. "This," she said, "is what I saw." "In the mountain shelter," I said, "before that." She met my eyes. "When I walked into that shelter and saw what you had built from nothing in a space everyone had written off." She paused. "I saw someone who makes things livable. That's rarer than any skill I could have put on a list." I was quiet for a moment. "You were very certain about me." "I was correct about you," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing. In this case, they were." She left, and I stood for a moment in the fragrant warmth of the healer's space that was mine, that I had built, and felt the thing I had gone up the mountain looking for settle fully and finally in my chest. Not belonging given to me by someone else's grace, belonging made, the way you make bread, the way you make a shelter habitable, from effort and time, and the willingness to keep the door open. That evening, Aiden found me on the steps of the hall, watching the last light leave the sky. He sat beside me without ceremony. The air was warm for once, the northern reach briefly persuaded toward spring, and somewhere in the trees behind the compound, a bird was doing something optimistic. "Kale says you told him he's good at navigation," he said. "He is. He's been insufferable about it for 2 days." "I know," I said. "I planned that." He made a sound that was fully, unambiguously a laugh, low and quiet, but real. I had heard it a handful of times over the year, and it still did something to the inside of my chest that I had long since stopped pretending it didn't. We sat for a while in comfortable silence, the kind you can only sit in with someone you have built something real with. "Annie," he said. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me, that open, certain look. He reached over and took my hand. Not briefly this time. Settled, deliberate. His thumb moved once across my knuckles. A small gesture, a quiet one, the kind that carries more than elaborate words. "I'm glad you opened the door," he said. I looked at our hands, at the stars beginning to show above the tree line, at the warm light coming from the windows of the hall where the pack was gathered, and loud and alive. "I'm glad I ran out of patience for waiting," I said. He squeezed my hand gently, and we stayed there. In the warm evening, while the stars came fully out above the northern reach, not a blizzard in sight, not a door locked, not a cold thing left unattended between us. It was not a perfect life. There would be difficult winters, and council pressures, and mornings when the weight of things would be heavy. Roan's ankle would ache in bad weather, and he would deny it. Kale would get lost at least twice more before summer ended. Petra would remain sharp-tongued, though she had stopped directing it at me, and I had come to find it, quietly, useful. Sable would continue being correct about things. That I was certain would never change. And I, who had been overlooked and underestimated and left to the edges of every room I had ever entered, had built a shelter in the middle of a blizzard and kept the bread warm and opened the door. That was what I was. I understood it fully now. Not a deficiency. Not something to outgrow or overcome. The most important thing in the room.